All right, so I've got my slides up, and I'm starting with this one to make sure that I'm walking the walk and practicing what I preach. You can go ahead and take out the camera on your phone and scan the QR code, or you can type this URL into a browser, you can type it out, so that you can have access to my slides. Now, you might find it odd that I've made it a point to mention this explicitly, and it's because I'm a sign language linguist, I'm also a real linguist. And I work with sign languages, which means that we need to see people that we are studying in order to see the language. Our primary form of documenting source language is photo and video, which means that you see people's faces, you will see people's faces in my talk. And so when you do research, of course, you have to get informed consent, and you don't always have permission to share their information. So I'm being explicit here about permission and sharing, and I'm being explicit because it is unfortunately not a widespread practice in our field. Okay, so I am here today to talk about the inclusion of deaf linguists and sign languages in linguistics. For that, I have to thank Nick for inviting me to the panel. It is truly an honor to be here. And I would also like to say that I follow all the panelists on Twitter. So when I saw who my co-panelists were, I was just overjoyed. So thank you so much. I just unlocked a new level. What else? I also want to say something. Right. These are the dangers of signing. I have to move away from the podium, go back to the podium. I have an Apple Watch now, though, so that means I get more steps every time I go back to the podium. So this topic is unfortunately not talked about very often. Deaf linguists or sign languages are rarely included in broader discussions, so I'm grateful to have the space to talk about this, but I'm not the first by any means to talk about this. I think that it's high time that our discussions in a smaller segment of our field are brought to a broader audience. So thank you so much for your time and attention and for listening. In the first few minutes, I'm going to talk about who I am, as that informs my stance and my position. And then I will, and also that will foreshadow some of the things that I'll talk about later in the presentation. I lived in Kenya for 2 years. I was in the Peace Corps. And when I went, I was surprised to find that they used a different sign language than we do here in the US. I worked at a school for deaf children on a dictionary project, the Kenyan Sign Language Dictionary Project. This was the first time I had actually engaged with another signing community using another sign language, and that was when I started to realize that language was a thing to be studied. So this had a tremendously formative impact on who I am now. After my time in Kenya, I came back to the States, went to Washington, D.C., where I attended Gallaudet University, graduated with a PhD in linguistics in 2005, after which I began teaching in the Department of Linguistics. And if you aren't familiar with the university, Gallaudet is the only liberal arts institution in the world that primarily serves deaf and hard of hearing students. We are happy to accommodate hearing students as well. But it is definitely a signing community, as you can see here. This is on the side of our library, proclaiming that we are Gallaudet, and you can see an illustration of someone signing Gallaudet, and then again broadly proclaiming that we are a signing community. As I mentioned, I do teach at Gallaudet in the Department of Linguistics. I teach in a number of topics, and this is important. I teach in the Department of Linguistics. So we do talk about sign language, but I teach linguistics. I teach phonology, morphology, syntax, and I talk about both spoken and sign languages. So I'm not teaching sign language linguistics, but certainly our research predominantly focuses on sign language data. Listed on the right are the courses that I've taught. And yes, sign languages have a phonology. People are often surprised to find that is the case. And if you don't know, don't be embarrassed. Come up to me. I'll talk to you about how it is that we do have a phonology. And then the final course you can see here is field methods. I've taught field methods for researching a number of sign languages. So in case you didn't already know, sign language is not universal. There are over 200 documented sign languages that exist worldwide, perhaps more. So I know there's a lot of information on this slide. It's pretty busy, and I don't expect you to read everything and memorize it. I have all of this up here just to show that I have been involved in language documentation and corpus linguistics for a while, since 2006. That very cute kid up there on the left is my kid. So you can see that I've engaged in a number of projects, and the point of this slide is just to let you know that I have been working with many signing communities for a number of years, which means I've devoted a lot of thought to how to work with signing communities, but I also have devoted a lot of thought to what human language is and what the bigger picture is, and how the stories of signing communities inform what we know about human language, and how what we know about human language informs how we work with signing communities. And of course that means I work with people. And as such, I have to think about the consequences of my work, and therefore have to think about ethics. And here are just some examples of publications on ethics, specifically when working with signing communities. So I just put these citations up here so you can refer to them. And basically all of them reach the conclusion, I think this is true for many guidelines when it comes to talking with linguistic communities, that basically all of them say when you work with a community, members of the community need to be actively involved and or leading those efforts. Now, everything I'm going to talk about today is not just about my experience. Of course, it is colored by my experience, and I say this though to say that I am not representing everybody's experience, but as we said earlier, I also have had experience from talking with other people, and I'm using a very academic source, Twitter, but it is the source of a great deal of conversation about this very important topic. This is a screenshot of a survey. The actual text is not the intent of the slide, so the actual text is not important. I conducted a survey about the inclusion of deaf linguists and sign language in linguistics. So I wanted to have a more formal way of getting information about this topic. I created a Google form and created a screen movie of the survey. Again, the point is not to read the text. The point is to see how I use an online modality in a multimodal way. So I'll run through that screen movie and then talk more about the survey. I use my kids a lot. Hopefully they won't hate me when they get older for doing this. So the Google form is indicative of how I use multiple modes to communicate. So I used sign language, as you saw in the survey, and as you can hear, speak, write, or gesture in other formats, but as a signer, I am accustomed to using multiple modes, and I wanted to capitalize on as many modes as possible. So what you saw in the survey was text, animated GIFs. That's a great way to capture gesture, English, signing. I also used emojis, which I could use in different ways for different purposes. For me, I often use them to show the hand shapes that are used in sign languages. Oh, and I made a video of myself to include a bio, because I asked all respondents to include a bio of themselves. So I started out with a bio of myself in my native language. So I didn't just cop out and express my bio in English. I presented it in ASL, and a good number of people who responded filmed themselves as well to share their bios. So I wanted to be fair in how I was asking for information and how I was giving it. And I got almost 50, I was gonna say. I got 49 respondents, and I was pretty surprised. I was expecting more like 5. And it was impossible to incorporate all of what they shared, but it was a great way of seeing to what degree my experience was reflected in their responses, and it allowed me to identify patterns in our experiences. Of course, there are individual differences, but as a group, we were able to look at patterns that were representative of everybody's experiences. So all of that is a backdrop of what I'm here to discuss. And I'd like to focus on the inclusion of sign languages in linguistics. Why should we include sign languages? And to that, I would say, why not? If you study linguistics, you study human behavior, and you therefore know that humans are very diverse, and we can adapt to a number of situations, and you know that humans have multiple ways of being. So when you ignore one of the primary expressions of sign language, which is signing, you are missing a huge part of human languages. If you want to study linguistics, then sign languages are a part of that, period. And again, I'm not the only one to have said this. We have 7 decades of research that has amply shown that sign languages have a place in linguistics. So this shouldn't be a question that we have to ponder any further. I'm going to assume that everyone in the room agrees with me on that point, so I'll move to my next one. I'd like to discuss the inclusion of deaf linguists. When you study a language, or a phenomenon, you need to understand the people who had those experiences, because their lived experiences are important. So this means when you're studying signing communities, you're studying deaf people. And not only deaf people who were born to other deaf people, who are multi-generationally deaf, because this population actually constitutes a very small percentage of the signing community. There are some linguists that only focus on this population, which again is very small. The overwhelming majority of deaf people are born to hearing parents who do not sign and arrive at signing at different times and in different ways. And those experiences are important to include. So that's part of the point, but why is it not happening? For a number of reasons. Barriers for one. For example, regarding sign language itself, there are active efforts from audiologists and others to suppress the use of sign language in favor of using audiological devices like cochlear implants or hearing aids to further push us toward a standard hearing norm, whatever that is. A second reason is that involving deaf people starts to become logistically challenging. So I do have to say thank you to Nick here for addressing the topic of getting interpreters. It really does require a great deal of forethought, and it requires doing something different, which requires more or different effort. There are ongoing solutions or ongoing things that are happening that are positive, and I'll talk about that for the remainder of the talk. The notation at the top is from what's called the Stokey notation system. This is used in sign language linguistics. So signing, of course, takes on different forms, and you have to have a way to transcribe and describe that form. William Stokey is one of the first to have done this, and this is one way, as you can see on the top, of representing signing in text. Now, if you think that this is a great system, I have a dissertation that's over 400 pages long that says why it's not an ideal system, but it was worthwhile because it was the first attempt to create a notation to describe the form of sign languages. William Stokoe is pictured here on the far right. He's the gentleman in glasses. He is a hearing American. He learned how to sign after he started working at Gallaudet. He was an English teacher. And to do that, he learned how to sign and was interested a great deal in what it was that deaf people were doing with their hands. So he used what he knew about linguistics to start analyzing what he was seeing. His co-authors are seated with him. And this wasn't really the first publication about American Sign Language, but it is one of the most well-known and is largely a seminal work because it gave way to a great deal more research on American Sign Language. After Stokoe went on to publish around 100 more publications, but this is the one that has received the most attention. In sign language research, deaf people are often the field workers. We're there on the ground. We do the annotations, we code, we elicit, we collect. We often aren't the writers, we aren't the leaders, we aren't the ones that attend conferences. Because of things like this, it's invisible labor. Looking for interpreters, being our own advocates takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of energy. And most deaf people don't continue on to college. If they do reach post-secondary education, the numbers drop quite dramatically. The green line are the rates of higher education or educational attainment among hearing people, and the blue line is educational attainment among deaf people. Only 0.6, so 0.6% of deaf people attain an MD, JD, or PhD. This is part of the reason why we don't have the credentials or credibility to lead the work, because we don't have the academic training for it. Yet, we do exist. There are other deaf linguists. A couple of them are pictured here. This is not all of them. And to be honest, when I thought about who to put on the slide, it was really overwhelming. So I picked them at random. The only thing I did was try to alternate what gender they appear as. So I tried to make sure that they at least had a PhD and that they were affiliated with an academic institution. So at first glance, you can see that people of color are not represented, not well represented, and primarily they work at or are affiliated with American or European or generally North American institutions. One of the people pictured on the last slide, Joseph Hill, talks here about the importance of including deaf linguists. I'll give you a moment to read the quote. Does everyone have enough time? Thank you for using the gesture. Thank you. So going back to the fact that I look at conversations that are happening on Twitter, Joshua Racklaw mentioned that none of his core course offerings in his PhD programs in linguistics mentioned sign language. So it's sort of like the default, the field of linguistics should be called spoken language linguistics, is what Bryn Hawk said in her response to him. It seems like most people come across information about sign languages on Twitter. And Bryn Hawk goes on to say that it seems that autism, AUDISM, is perhaps one of the reasons. So racism, sexism, are familiar to most people in the room, but autism might be a less familiar term, but it is nevertheless a form of discrimination that occurs against deaf people. When you think about representation in the general literature, I asked in the Google form, excuse the interpretation, I asked respondents on the Google form to think about representation in the literature. The question was, in general, how representative do you think basic introduction to linguistics texts are of sign languages? 5 means very well representative. 1 means not representative at all. So of course this got me thinking, and again, looking at conversations happening on Twitter and in other platforms online, I started to think about other forms of accessing information so that we're not only looking at very traditional forms like peer-reviewed journals, but non-traditional formats like Twitter or online publications. This perhaps should start to be looked at places where discussions happen about legitimate scholarly things. This is the last point that I'll make, and then I'll wrap up. Again, I'll give you a moment to read this. And sorry, I'm reading while you might still be reading the slides. Sorry that I'm reading over. But typically at conferences, sign languages are sort of categorized as their own thing. And Deborah Wager describes this as the ghettoization of sign language research at conferences. However, an alternative to this is something that we saw in the program at this year's group. So thank you to Nick and for anyone else that had a hand in that decision. Now, time is out. You look pretty tired. It's the end of the day. So I'm going to let you read through the next few slides. I do have more content, but I'm just going to jump through the next couple slides so I can get to my final point. I had to approve the So conferences, we all know, are great for networking, but where does that networking happen? In the hallways, at coffee breaks, at the transition times. Twitter is our big coffee break. So I hope that I've given you some food for thought. You might not have thought about these things before. I'm not asking any of you to become experts in sign language or to learn ASL, but I am asking you to think about the impact of your actions, and even just in actions that seem quite little, like listening, or using words like speech, or speaking. Why not say language users, or use language that's more inclusive? When you do that and you broaden your language, you open yourselves up to more stories. Thank you for listening to my story. I'm interested in hearing yours. Thank you very much.